March 2, 1943. Japan loaded 6,900 elite soldiers onto 8 transport ships bound for New Guinea, seasoned veterans ready to fight for a critical airbase. Within 72 hours, American B-25 bombers had slaughtered 5,700 of them before they could even fire their rifles, turning the Bismarck Sea into a graveyard using a radical new bombing technique the Japanese had never seen before. But here's what haunts historians. How did America perfect a weapon so devastating that it killed 83% of an enemy force that never even reached the battlefield? And what did the survivors realize about the war in those final moments in the water? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. February 1943. The war in the Pacific was not going well for Japan. For more than a year, Japanese soldiers had been winning battles across Asia and the Pacific Ocean. They had taken the Philippines. They had taken Singapore. They had pushed deep into China and swept across islands most people had never heard of. But now, something was changing. The Americans had landed on an island called Guadalcanal 6 months earlier, and after brutal fighting in jungles and on beaches, Japan had lost. They had to pull their men out in February, leaving behind thousands of dead soldiers and abandoning the island entirely. It was Japan's first major defeat, and it sent shockwaves through the military command in Tokyo. The Solomon Islands and New Guinea had become the new battleground. Whoever controlled these islands controlled the shipping lanes to Australia. If Japan could hold them, they could cut off Australia from American help and maybe even invade it. If America took them, they could use them as stepping stones to push north toward Japan itself. So these jungle islands, these little dots on the map that nobody back home could pronounce, suddenly mattered more than anyone had imagined. And right in the middle of this fight was a place called Lae on the northern coast of New Guinea. Lae had an airbase. Whoever held Lae could send bombers and fighters across the region. The Japanese held it, but barely. American and Australian forces were pressing closer every day, and the soldiers defending Lae were running low on supplies, ammunition, and men. Within Tokyo, the generals looked at their maps and made a decision. They would send reinforcements. Not just a few hundred men, but thousands. They would load up transport ships with an entire division of troops, along with food, weapons, and ammunition, and send them from Rabaul to Lae. Rabaul was Japan's biggest base in the South Pacific, a fortress on the island of New Britain with multiple airfields and a deep harbor protected by volcanoes. From Rabaul to Lae was about 500 miles across a body of water called the Bismarck Sea. The plan seemed simple enough. Load the men onto ships, surround the transports for protection, and make the voyage in about 3 days. The weather forecast said there would be clouds and maybe some rain. Perfect. The clouds would hide them from American reconnaissance planes. The soldiers chosen for this mission were not new recruits. They came from the 51st Division, battle-hardened veterans who had fought in China and Manchuria. These were men who knew how to survive in jungles, how to dig trenches, how to fight with rifles and bayonets. Many of them were in their 20s and 30s, some were teenagers. They wrote letters home before boarding the ships, the kind of letters soldiers write when they know they might not come back. They told their families they were proud to serve the emperor. They said they hoped to bring honor to their villages. Some tucked photographs of their wives and children into their uniforms. Others carried small charms from temples or shrines. On February 28, 1943, the convoy assembled in Rabaul's harbor. 8 large transport ships sat low in the water, packed with 6,900 soldiers and tons of supplies. Around them formed a protective ring of 8 destroyers, sleek warships bristling with guns and torpedoes. The destroyers were supposed to shoot down any American planes that came close and depth charge any submarines that tried to attack. Japanese naval commanders felt confident. They had done convoy runs like this before. Yes, the Americans had planes, but high-altitude bombing rarely hit moving ships. The bombers would drop their payloads from thousands of feet up, the ships would turn and dodge, and most of the bombs would splash harmlessly into the ocean. That was how it had always worked. The soldiers climbed aboard the transports and settled into cramped compartments below deck. There was not much room. Men sat shoulder to shoulder on benches or on the floor, their rifles stacked nearby, their packs stuffed with everything they would need once they landed. The air smelled like sweat and engine oil and the salt of the sea. Some men tried to sleep. Others talked quietly, making jokes to hide their nerves. A few played card games or wrote more letters they hoped to mail once they reached Leh. Above them, the ship's engines rumbled to life. On the morning of February 28th, the convoy steamed out of Rabaul Harbor and turned west toward New Guinea. For the first day, everything seemed fine. The weather was overcast, just as predicted. Thick clouds hung low over the water, and visibility was poor. The soldiers could hear the waves slapping against the hull and feel the ship rolling gently beneath them. Some got seasick and stumbled to the railings. The destroyers maintained their positions around the transports, their lookouts scanning the skies. Radio operators listened for warnings. Officers checked their watches and calculated how much longer until they reached Leh. Above them, the ship's engines rumbled to life. On the morning of February 28th, the convoy steamed out of Rabaul Harbor and turned west toward New Guinea. For the first day, everything seemed fine. The weather was overcast, just as predicted. Thick clouds hung low over the water, and visibility was poor. The soldiers could hear the waves slapping against the hull and feel the ship rolling gently beneath them. Some got seasick and stumbled to the railings. The destroyers maintained their positions around the transports, their lookouts scanning the skies. Radio operators listened for warnings. Officers checked their watches and calculated how much longer until they reached Leh. But something they did not know was already happening. On March 1st, an American B-24 bomber on a routine reconnaissance patrol spotted the convoy through a break in the clouds. The pilot radioed back to Port Moresby, the Allied air base in southern New Guinea. The message was brief but urgent. Large Japanese convoy heading west through the Bismarck Sea, multiple transports, heavy destroyer escort. Within minutes, American and Australian commanders were gathering in operations rooms, spreading maps across tables, and making plans. They had bombers, they had fighters, and they had something else, something new that the Japanese had never seen before. They had been practicing a tactic for months, modifying their B-25 Mitchell bombers in ways that seemed almost crazy. Now they would get to test it against a real target.
Below deck on the transport ships, some soldiers thought they heard the distant drone of aircraft engines overhead on March 1st, but officers told them it was nothing to worry about, just reconnaissance. The Americans always sent scouts. It did not mean anything. The convoy kept moving west through choppy seas under gray skies. The men tried to rest. They had no idea what was coming. March 2nd, 1943 dawned gray and cold over the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese convoy was now 2 days into its journey, and the soldiers below deck had settled into an uncomfortable routine. They ate rice from metal bowls. They checked their weapons for the 100th time. They tried to ignore the smell of vomit from men who could not handle the rolling of the ships. Some managed to sleep sitting up with their heads against the bulkheads. Others stared at nothing and thought about what waited for them at Leh. They expected jungle fighting, probably an amphibious landing under fire, maybe digging in against American artillery. What they did not expect was what happened next. Around mid-morning on March 2nd, the sound came first. A distant rumble that grew louder and louder until it filled the air like thunder that would not stop. The soldiers looked up at the ceiling of their cramped compartments. Some stood and moved toward the ladders that led to the deck. Officers shouted for them to stay below, to remain calm, but the roar kept growing. Then came a new sound, a screaming howl of engines dropping low, and suddenly the entire ship shuddered as if it had been punched by a giant fist. Machine gun fire ripped across the deck above them. Not the slow pop, pop, pop of rifles, but a continuous tearing sound like fabric being shredded at impossible speed. Men screamed. Alarm bells started ringing. The ship lurched hard to one side. What the soldiers could not see, trapped below deck, was a sight that would have frozen their blood. American B-25 Mitchell bombers were coming in at wave-top height, so low that their propellers seemed to almost touch the ocean. These were not normal bombers flying at 10,000 or 20,000 feet like the Japanese expected. These planes were roaring in at 10 to 15 feet above the water, close enough that sailors on the destroyer decks could see the faces of the American pilots through the cockpit glass. And the front of each B-25 had been transformed into something terrifying. 8 50-caliber machine guns pointed straight forward from the nose, 4 on each side. When those guns opened fire, they sent out a wall of bullets that could saw a man in half. The first pass caught the Japanese completely off guard. Anti-aircraft gunners on the destroyers tried to swing their guns down low enough to track the bombers, but the planes were moving too fast and flying too close to the water. By the time a gunner got his sights lined up, the B-25 had already screamed past and was pulling up and away. The machine guns from the bombers raked across the decks of both destroyers and transports. Men manning the anti-aircraft positions died before they could fire a shot, cut down by the hail of 50-caliber rounds. Others dove for cover behind anything they could find. And then came the bombs.
But these bombs did not fall from high altitude and take long seconds to drop. The B-25s released them while flying almost at sea level, and the bombs had special delayed fuses set for 5 seconds. When a bomb left the plane at that height and speed, it did not drop straight down. It skipped across the water like a flat stone thrown by a child across a pond. The bombs would hit the surface, bounce once or twice, and slam into the side of a ship right at the waterline. Then, 5 seconds later, they exploded. The explosion happened inside the hull or right against it, tearing massive holes below the surface where water would pour in fastest. It was devastatingly effective. The first transport took a bomb to its midsection. The soldiers inside heard a clang like a giant hammer hitting metal, and then the world exploded. The blast tore through bulkheads and sent shrapnel flying in all directions. Men were thrown against walls. Lights went out. Steam from broken pipes filled the compartments. Water began rushing in through the gaping hole in the hull. The ship started to list, tilting slowly to one side as thousands of tons of seawater poured into its belly. Soldiers scrambled for the ladders, pushing and shoving in the darkness, trying to reach the deck before the ship went down. Wave after wave of B-25s came in. They worked in coordinated groups, some strafing with machine guns to keep the defenders from firing back, others dropping their skip bombs with deadly accuracy. The Japanese had never seen anything like this. In all their training, all their briefings, nobody had prepared them for bombers that attacked like fighter planes, flying so low and fast that traditional defenses were useless. The destroyers tried to maneuver, tried to put themselves between the bombers and the transports, but it made little difference. One by one, the transport ships were hit. Some took multiple bombs. Fires broke out on several vessels. Black smoke rose into the gray sky. By the afternoon of March 3rd, all 8 transport ships had been hit. Some sank quickly, going down in minutes. Others burned and listed for hours before finally slipping beneath the waves. Soldiers poured onto the decks and jumped or were thrown into the water. Many of these men had grown up in inland villages and cities. They had never learned to swim. Japan is an island nation, but swimming was not a common skill, especially among rural farm boys who made up much of the army. These soldiers hit the water wearing full uniforms, heavy boots, and packs. They sank like stones. Those who could swim or who managed to grab onto floating debris faced a new horror. The B-25s came back, flying low over the water, and opened fire on the men in the sea. The official reason was that the Americans wanted to prevent any soldiers from reaching shore and reinforcing lie, but the effect was slaughter. 50-caliber rounds churned the water white. Men who had survived the sinking of their ships died floating in their life preservers. Others drowned when wreckage pulled them under or when exhaustion finally overcame them. Some were attacked by sharks, drawn to the blood and thrashing. The water temperature was not freezing, but after hours of exposure, hypothermia set in. Men simply gave up and let the ocean take them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The few destroyers that survived tried to pick up survivors, but they were also under constant attack. They could not stop for long. They pulled a few hundred men from the water and then had to run, racing back toward Rabaul with American planes still hunting them. Behind them, the Bismarck Sea was littered with wreckage, oil slicks, and bodies. Of the 6,900 soldiers who had left Rabaul just days before, somewhere between 5,500 and 5,700 were dead. Most had drowned. Almost none had fired their weapons in combat. The survivors floated in the oil-slicked water and clung to pieces of wood, to empty crates, to anything that would keep them from sinking. Some held on to the bodies of their dead friends because even a corpse could provide buoyancy. The sun had broken through the clouds now, and it beat down on them without mercy. Salt water stung their eyes and filled their mouths when waves washed over them. Their uniforms were soaked and heavy. Their boots had filled with water. Many had already kicked them off, letting them sink into the darkness below. The lucky ones had managed to grab life preservers before their ships went down. The unlucky ones treaded water until their legs stopped working. In those hours floating in the Bismarck Sea, waiting to be rescued or to die, something broke inside the men who survived. They had been told their entire lives that the Japanese warrior spirit was superior. They had been taught that Americans were soft, that they loved comfort too much to be truly dangerous, that they would collapse when faced with soldiers who were willing to die for their emperor. The propaganda had been constant and loud. Japan would win because Japanese soldiers had discipline and honor and were not afraid of death. America would lose because Americans valued their own lives too much and would surrender when things got hard. But floating there in the water, surrounded by the dead, the survivors had to face a truth that shattered everything they believed. The Americans had not fought them with spirit or honor or courage. The Americans had fought them with machines. Modified bombers that could fly lower than anyone thought possible. Skip bombing techniques that turned the ocean surface into a weapon. Coordinated waves of aircraft that came in one after another without stopping. This was not a battle. This was extermination. This was what happened when one side could afford to take hundreds of bombers and fighters, practice new tactics for months, modify the planes with extra guns, and then throw all of that industrial power at a single convoy. One soldier, clinging to a floating ammunition box, would later try to explain what went through his mind. "We trained for 6 months to take that beachhead at Leh. We learned how to move through jungle without making noise. We practiced charging with bayonets until our hands bled. We were ready to fight and die on land like soldiers, but we drowned before we ever saw the shore. Their machines learned faster than we could march." What he meant was simple but devastating. The time it took to train thousands of men, transport them across the ocean, and organize them into an invasion force was longer than the time it took America to invent a completely new way to sink ships and then perfect it. The survivors who were eventually pulled from the water by Japanese destroyers and submarines faced a new kind of horror when they got back to Rabaul. They were forbidden from talking about what happened. The military command classified the disaster immediately. Families back in Japan would receive notices that their sons and husbands and fathers had been killed in action, but nothing more. No details. No explanation of how nearly an entire division had been wiped out before landing. The scale of the loss was simply too embarrassing, too demoralizing to admit publicly. So the survivors were scattered to different units and ordered to stay silent. Some were sent back into combat on other islands. Others were assigned to garrison duty. But all of them carried the same knowledge, the same realization that would not leave them alone.
They had seen the gap. Not the gap in courage or fighting spirit, but the gap in production. The Americans could afford to lose bombers in experiments and training accidents and still have more. They could afford to pull planes off the assembly line and cut them apart and rebuild them with different guns and different tactics. They could afford to have entire squadrons practice one specific technique over and over until they got it perfect. Japan could not afford any of that. Japan was rationing fuel. Japan was conserving ammunition. Japan was sending its best soldiers on ships that had inadequate air cover because there were not enough planes or pilots to protect them properly. One survivor, interviewed decades later, remembered lying on the deck of the destroyer that rescued him, coughing up seawater, watching the sky for more American bombers. He said he realized in that moment that the war was already over and nobody had told them. You cannot defeat a nation that can perfect a new way to kill you faster than you can write letters home. That was the heart of it, speed. Not just the speed of the planes, but the speed of innovation, the speed of production, the speed at which America could identify a problem and throw resources at solving it. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not even a battle in the traditional sense. It was an industrial demonstration. It showed what happened when a country with massive factories and oil fields and universities full of engineers decided to apply all of that capacity to war. The Japanese soldiers had been brave, they had been well trained, they had been willing to die. None of that mattered. They died because their nation could not build enough ships or planes fast enough. They died because the enemy could modify hundreds of bombers while Japan struggled to keep its existing aircraft flying. They died because modern war was no longer won by the bravest soldiers, but by the side with more factories. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound and permanent. They had believed in something their entire lives, and it had been proven false in the most brutal way possible. Some became bitter. Some became depressed. Some simply became quiet and never spoke about the war again, even after it ended. But all of them understood, perhaps better than their commanders in Tokyo, that Japan could not win this war. The math was too simple. America could replace everything it lost. Japan could not. America could innovate and adapt faster than Japan could respond. That was the lesson of the Bismarck Sea, written in the bodies of 5,700 men who drowned waiting for a battle that never came. The war dragged on for 2 more years after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, but the survivors who had floated in that oil-slicked water knew how it would end long before the rest of Japan did. They fought on other islands. They dug defensive positions. They fired their rifles at American Marines advancing through jungles and across beaches. Some died in those later battles. Others survived, all the way to August 1945 when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the emperor's voice crackled over radio speakers telling his people that they must endure the unendurable and surrender. For the men who had survived the Bismarck Sea, surrender was not unendurable. It was inevitable. They had known it was coming since March 1943.
The journey home took months for most of them. Some were held in Allied prisoner-of-war camps for weeks or months after the surrender, while paperwork was processed and transportation was arranged. Others made their way back through a chaotic network of damaged railways and commandeered ships. When they finally arrived in Japan in late 1945 and early 1946, what they found was almost harder to process than the battle itself had been. The Japan they returned to was not the Japan they had left. The cities were flattened. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities had been firebombed into wastelands of ash and twisted metal. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were simply gone, vaporized and irradiated. Millions of civilians were homeless, living in shacks made from scrap wood and metal sheets. Food was desperately scarce. Children begged in the streets. The proud empire that had stretched across Asia and the Pacific had been reduced to rubble. One survivor of the Bismarck Sea stepped off a train in what used to be his hometown and stood on the platform looking at ruins. His family's house was gone. The neighborhood he grew up in was gone. He carried a small pack with everything he owned in the world: a spare shirt, a pair of socks with holes in them, a dented metal cup, And tucked inside his shirt, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a waterlogged photograph of his unit taken in Rabaul before they boarded the transports. Most of the faces in that photograph were dead. He had pulled it from the pocket of a floating corpse in the Bismarck Sea because he could not stand the thought of it sinking into darkness with no one to remember those men. The contrast hit all the survivors the same way. They had seen American industrial power in action during the war, but now they saw it again during the occupation. American jeeps drove through the ruined streets. American trucks delivered food to distribution centers. American engineers surveyed damage and planned reconstruction. The same nation that had perfected skip bombing in a matter of weeks was now organizing the feeding and rebuilding of its defeated enemy with similar efficiency. General MacArthur's occupation government brought in food shipments that kept millions from starving. They brought in medicine. They brought in construction materials. And they did it all with a speed and scale that seemed impossible to people who had spent the last years of the war eating grass and tree bark. Some of the Bismarck Sea survivors ended up working for the occupation forces, doing manual labor or translation or clerical work. They needed the money and the food rations that came with the jobs. And in those jobs, they saw up close the same abundance they had glimpsed in battle. American mess halls threw away more food in a day than a Japanese family might see in a week. American supply depots were stacked with crates and crates of everything imaginable: soap, toilet paper, cigarettes, canned food, chocolate bars. The survivors remembered floating in the water watching their own supply ships sink with food and ammunition they desperately needed, and now they watched American supplies arrive in seemingly endless convoys.
One veteran got a job at an American motor pool helping to maintain the vehicles. He had been a mechanic before the war, so he understood engines. What amazed him was not the machines themselves, but the system behind them. When a Jeep broke down, the Americans did not try to rebuild the broken part like the Japanese army had done. They simply pulled out a new part from inventory and installed it. The broken part went into a bin to be shipped back to a depot somewhere. Everything was standardized. Every bolt and screw and wire was the same across thousands of vehicles. That meant any mechanic could fix any vehicle with parts that were always available. It was the same principle that had made the skip bombing work: standardization, mass production, interchangeable parts, the ability to scale up any operation to whatever size was needed. But what haunted the Bismarck Sea survivors more than anything was not the abundance or the machines. It was kind. American soldiers were not the monsters the propaganda had described. They gave chocolate to Japanese children. They helped old women carry heavy loads. They set up medical clinics that treated Japanese civilians for free. This was not the behavior of soft, weak people. This was the behavior of people who had won so completely that they could afford to be generous. The same industrial capacity that had killed 5,700 men in 3 days was now being used to rebuild the country those men had died trying to defend. It was almost too much to understand. One survivor tried to explain it to his wife years later. He told her about floating in the Bismarck Sea, surrounded by the dead, watching B-25s fly past so low he could see the rivets on their wings. He told her about coming home to find their city destroyed by B-29s, the bigger brothers of those B-25s. And then he told her about watching American construction crews rebuild a bridge in their neighborhood in 3 weeks, working with cranes and trucks and prefabricated materials that seemed to appear from nowhere. It was all the same thing, he said. It was all capacity. The capacity to destroy and the capacity to build. America had both in amounts that Japan could never match. The photograph he had pulled from the ocean stayed with him for the rest of his life. He kept it in a wooden box along with other small mementos. Sometimes he would take it out and look at the faces of men he had known, men who had drowned before they could fight. In the 1970s, a journalist interviewed him for a book about the Pacific War. The journalist asked him what he had learned from his experience. The veteran thought for a long time before answering. He said, "At the Bismarck Sea, I learned the war was already over. We just did not know it yet. You cannot defeat a nation that can perfect a new way to kill you faster than you can write letters home." That was the real lesson of the Bismarck Sea. And it was a lesson that shaped how survivors viewed the rest of their lives and how they raised their children. Japan could never fight that kind of war again. Never. The cost was too high, and the outcome was too certain. Some survivors became pacifists, arguing that war itself was now obsolete in an age of industrial slaughter. Others became advocates for economic development, believing that Japan's only path forward was to build its own industrial base so it would never again be so outmatched. Still others simply withdrew, working quiet jobs and trying to forget. But none of them could really forget. The memory of floating in that water was burned into them. The memory of watching ships sink with thousands of men trapped inside. The memory of the sound those B-25 engines made. That low roar that meant death was coming and there was nothing you could do to stop it. And the memory of realizing, really understanding for the first time, that bravery and training and willingness to die meant nothing against an enemy that could simply outproduce you. In the decades after the war, a few survivors went back to the Bismarck Sea. They took boats out to the area where the battle had happened and looked down into the blue water. Somewhere far below were the wrecks of 8 transport ships and the bones of 5,700 men. The survivors said prayers. They threw flowers into the water. They stood in silence. And they thought about what those men had carried with them to the bottom. Letters they never sent. Photographs of people they would never see again. Rifles that were never fired. Dreams of battles they would never fight. One of those survivors, standing on the deck of a boat in 1968, 25 years after the battle, said something that stayed with the others who were there. He said those men down there died waiting for a war that never came. They died in a different kind of war, one where the battlefield was an ocean and the enemy was a machine. The world had changed and nobody told them. Nobody told any of us. That was the legacy of the Bismarck Sea. It was a turning point where old ideas of war died along with the men in the water. Courage alone was not enough. Training was not enough. Willingness to sacrifice was not enough. Modern war required industrial capacity, technological innovation, and the ability to adapt faster than your enemy. Japan had learned that lesson at terrible cost. The 5,700 men who drowned in March 1943 were the price of that education, and their deaths taught the survivors something they would never forget. In the age of industrial warfare, the nation with the most factories wins. Everything else is just details. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.